There seems to have been in the last few years a bunch of movies made of the Tudor era, which would be roughly the 16th century, the reigns of Henry VIII through Elizabeth I. And in all of these movies, there is usually one or two or more beheading scenes, however much or however many such scenes one can plausibly cram into the plotline of a movie miniseries or a documentary even. And in each of these scenes, the person to be beheaded parades grandly out to the scaffold, makes a glorious dying speech, and then gracefully lays their head on the block and gets it over with. And there seems to be no freaking out, no resistance, even though most people think that, well, if they were in that situation, they probably would be freaking out or so scared they would probably be completely comatose by the time the execution happened. Although there are a few movies that do show Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard freaking out at their execution, actually the records indicate that both women died boldly, as Anne Boleyn put it, or made a goodly Christian end, as some witnesses to Catherine Howard's execution have indicated. There were several reasons for the lack of freaking out at Tudor executions, only one of which would be Hollywood dramatics as they're portrayed today, or family honor as it would have been considered then. There were other forces at work that would have compelled people not to panic or to resist at an execution, and it was probably those forces that would make a Tudor execution even more scary when you consider it than it actually was. The first thing to remember about justice in Tudor England was that there was no presumption of innocence. A person who was convicted, particularly of a serious crime like high treason, was presumed to be guilty. And because the king could do no wrong, his justice was always right. If you were arrested for treason, the automatic presumption was that you'd be guilty. Because of this automatic presumption, criminal defendants accused of treason were not permitted many of the protections that modern criminal defendants enjoy, such as the right to counsel, the right to cross-examine witnesses to see the evidence against them, or even to present a case in their own behalf other than their own statements why they felt that they did not commit treason against the king. The other thing to remember is that the beheading, although as grisly as it was actually a commuted or lesser sentence. The full-blown penalty for treason was for men to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. In other words, to be hanged until one was half conscious, cut down still alive, be disemboweled, emasculated, and various parts of the body stuck on pikes. The penalty for women for high treason was burning alive at the stake. So for the king to grant someone the right to be beheaded rather than to have these more grisly punishments was actually an act of royal mercy, and just because one was a nobleman was no guarantee that one would automatically be considered for beheading rather than the other two punishments. So the point of one being arrested for treason in Tudor times was not to declare and maintain one's innocence, but to cooperate and comply with the process in the hopes of being spared the full penalty for treason and receiving a more dignified and hopefully less painful end by being beheaded. The proper thing for a person who was accused of treason by the king to do was to confess, and if possible, to name names. There was another reason why people would want to comply to get the process over more quickly, and in an age where we may not be as attuned to lives of the hereafter or spiritual life, it may be hard to fathom the fear of the hereafter that people in Tudor England had. God was very real, so was the devil, so were ghosts, and one who did not make a goodly end could end up either in hell or else possibly wandering the earth as an unshriven ghost. And those were certainly calamities to be avoided. Someone would certainly want a death with benefit of clergy. A death with benefit of clergy meant that a person being killed had the right to have a clergyman present in their final hours to make their confession, make their soul good with God, and then also to provide them a Christian burial after death. The right of having a burial with clergy, or a death with right of clergy, was up to the king, as was the commutation of the sentence from the burning or hanging to the more honorable beheading. So it's another impetus for these people to want to cooperate with the process as quickly as possible. So, having been condemned to be beheaded, a person would want to make a confession to a priest and also to any public official that might happen to be able to get the confession to the king in the hopes of receiving a lesser sentence. Anne Boleyn thus asked the lieutenant of the Tower to hear her confession. She maintained her innocence, but wisely did not call into question the king's justice in ordering her beheading. After having heard one's confession and being shriven of one's sins in this life, the next step would be to make a Christian speech on the scaffold. There were several rules for this. One thing that a person did not do is to maintain their innocence. It would not do to go up onto the scaffold and protest that one was not guilty, one was innocent, and that the king's justice was wrong. There were several reasons for this. One being that one definitely risked the execution being changed from beheading to something far more grisly, but also the fact that at the executions, the crowds were extremely hostile and rowdy. They had come to see what in their minds was a good show, justice done, the king's justice done, and they were often loud and insulting and heckling to the person being executed. A person who did not merit the crowd's approval by humbly admitting their faults and submitting to the executioner usually risked a raucous, rowdy crowd, and also they risked upsetting the executioner, who would be potentially more clumsy in doing his job. Executioners in medieval England more routinely dealt with hangings and floggings and the more routine punishments. Very few of them had to do a beheading, let alone a full-out hanging, drawing, and quartering. So executioners could and would be clumsy at their task, particularly if they were angered by something that the accused had done, or if they were being unnerved by the crowd around them. Another thing one did not do in the execution speech is to question the king's justice or the king's mercy. Things that one could do in an execution speech would be, if one felt that one was innocent of the crimes, one could simply choose, as did George Boleyn, not to name his crimes, simply stating that he had committed acts too heinous to mention. Usually this was a safe way of signaling that he felt he was innocent, but refusing to implicate others, in this instance his sister, the Queen, who might suffer a worse death, because at that point there was still a question as to whether Anne might be beheaded or would ultimately be burned. So he would certainly have wanted to protect his sister by his own death, his own speech before his death. Another thing that one would do would be to call the crowd to pray for one as one was about to die. The thought being that the more prayers you have for your soul, the better off chances you have with God of going right to heaven, skipping hell, purgatory, and hopefully not coming back as a ghost. The other thing that someone did when they were being executed, was to pay the executioner his fee. This was so that he would do a better job of beheading the person. It would take only one stroke instead of more. There's no truth to the legend that executioners used 3 or more strokes as some form of reference to the Trinity or some other type of ritual. The fact was that many of them were inexperienced and often took a number of strokes to complete the task. There were differing opinions on how one was supposed to lay one's head on the block. The best way from an executioner's point of view would be to the side, as is done by Catherine Howard and Lady Jane Rockford in the miniseries, since that gave the executioner a better angle. However, some, such as Mary Queen of Scots, chose to lay the head straight down on the block, and because the executioner had less area of the neck exposed to work with and had to cut directly into the backbone, people who did so risked having to have more than one strike to amputate the head. Once the person was killed, the executioner would then take the head and raise it and say something to the effect of, "Such be the end of all the king's enemies, God save the king." There is no hint in the records of that time that this was done to show the head its own body and its own punishment. Rather, executions were public spectacles. They were meant to display the king's wrath and the king's justice, and to alert the people that the king's justice was done, and to deter people from committing treason. So the purpose of showing the people the head would be to show them that the king's justice had been done. The blood of an executed person was considered to have some sort of talismanic type, good luck charm type propensities, and so people would often dip their handkerchiefs or other pieces of cloth into the blood. Many times the executioner or the authorities would attempt to prevent this, as they did with Mary Queen of Scots, by ordering all the block and all of her clothing and any other items associated with her execution to be burnt. But people did consider articles dipped in blood of an executed person to have some sort of good luck charm properties. It's rather sick from our perspective, but that's how they thought then. So definitely people sought to, not only for their own honor's sake, but also the good of their eternal soul, and sometimes for the protection of their families, would seek to cooperate with the process by dying boldly and going through the movements that the process required, rather than unrealistically panicking or freaking out or resisting. So that's a basic rundown on the Tudor executions.